In 2013, the Center for Sustainable Shale Development issued performance standards for gas extraction. A number of experts have reviewed these standards for the Delaware Riverkeeper Network and have issued a report saying the guidelines fail to protect the environment and human health. Dr. Robert Howarth examined the impact of the standards on greenhouse gas emissions.
Well, I think they don't really require anything which hasn't been close to industry standard practice for the last many years, so they're very unambitious in that sense. They start with an optimistic note that they understand where the greenhouse gas emissions are coming from, and therefore we know how to reduce them. In fact, the science on the emissions is very rapidly evolving. It turns out that the emissions are a lot higher than we would have thought even a few years ago, and we're finding all sorts of additional sources. And so in a sense it's premature to come up with regulations for reducing it, but the regulations they propose, as I say, were basically common industry practice. I'd view them almost as a wishful thinking approach to sort of brush the problem under the rug, if you will. Well, there are a whole bunch of places where the regulations are ambiguous. It's not clear if they apply only to shale gas or if they also include shale oil, which has a lot of methane emissions associated with it, for instance. It's not clear if new fields are being included or not. They seem to give provisions for excluding exploratory fields, and yet exploratory fields are never really defined. So there's a lack of clear definition, a lack of clear meaning, and they just don't really take us any further than what industry is mostly already doing and what government already requires, which isn't enough. I mean, the methane emissions are horrendous at the moment. Well, classically, one of the major sources we've worried about is this flowback venting of methane right after hydraulic fracturing during the few days to a few weeks when the fluids are flowing back to the surface. Industry has often simply vented the methane because it's difficult for them to capture that and put it in the pipeline until the flowback is more under control. About a year ago, January of 2014, EPA promulgated regulations to try and reduce that, although they have a lot of exceptions, too many exceptions. They don't have clear enforcement approaches. So these standards that are proposed by the industry group here are nothing more than what EPA has already required, in fact. And there is no clear enforcement mechanism for that. They're supposed to require flaring, that is burning, instead of simply venting the unburned methane to the atmosphere. In another year, where it's possible to do so, the regulations, federal regulations that is, will require that the gas go to market, but again with a lot of exceptions and no clear way to enforce this regulation. And CSSD takes us no further than that at all. Well, there isn't any routine monitoring of what these emissions are. So it's the standards are for industry to self-report what they think they're emitting. And there's an inherent conflict of interest there. And the oil and gas industry, quite frankly, does not have a strong track record for being honest in their self-reporting. So if you're going to have a standard with any teeth in it, there need to be enforcement agents who are out there vigorously inspecting and not simply relying on what industry self-reports. Yeah, there's several studies. Let me speak just briefly to that. Tony Ingraffi and Renee Santoro and I published the first ever paper on what methane emissions might be from shale gas, and we published that in the spring of 2011. Before that, there were no published papers on what the estimates might be, and the quality of information that was available to us was relatively poor. We used the best available information, and I think we did a good job of interpreting the best available information, but it was not a lot of information. We estimated there to be reasonably high methane emissions from shale gas, somewhat higher than from conventional gas. But since then, there have been a large increase in the number of actual field studies, people going out and measuring things from airplane or from towers and other integrated studies. Most of those, I would say, have shown us to be conservative in our estimates, particularly for shale gas. It looks like the emission estimates are probably twice what we had estimated originally. Once the flowback material comes to the surface, you have a nasty mess of material. It's mostly water, which is what industry likes to tell you, but it's mostly water with a lot of nasty stuff in it. Some of those are chemical additives that they've added to the fracking process. part of it are materials, radioactive and otherwise, that are extracted from the shale formations. The fracking fluids are very efficient at doing that. So you have to do something with this material, and industry is still searching for something to do. It's really one of the big problems with fracking, and they've tried a variety of things. In Pennsylvania for a while, some of it was going into traditional sewage treatment plants, which just are not designed to handle that, and a lot of the materials flowing out into rivers and surface water is a big problem. Pennsylvania now prohibits that, although our state of New York does not, and we take in some material from Pennsylvania still, so that's an issue. But one of the favorite solutions of industry has been this deep well injection. Take the material, put it out of sight deep into old, unused wells, which have been abandoned. And there are several issues with that. In the Northeast, there aren't enough wells, quite frankly, in Pennsylvania. So you have to ship the waste a long way, which is expensive, and industry doesn't like to do it. But in places where they have done it, they've seen a large increase in the number of earthquakes directly as a result of this injection. And that was perhaps controversial a few years ago because the whole business of shale gas development was new, but people started to notice more earthquakes. There's no ambiguity about it now. There's several published studies. Government and academic scientists have done a great job of showing the connection between the disposal technique and increasing earthquakes. They say that there should be a survey of geological vulnerabilities, but they don't tell us what those vulnerabilities may be. And you can think of several. One would be natural fracture lines, which you clearly want to avoid. Probably they mean that, although they don't say so. But there are also pre-existing gas wells or pre-existing mining operations or all sorts of things in these areas, which are not necessarily included in those regulations and need to be. You know, I'm a co-author of a study that we published early in 2014 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. We did an airplane flyover, had an airplane equipped with equipment to monitor methane, so we could fly through plumes coming from the ground, map them out, estimate how much methane was coming out. And we found large amounts of methane coming out of some wells just as they're being drilled, had not yet reached the Marcellus Shale, had not yet been hydraulically fractured. And it's pretty clear that that methane is coming from hitting pockets of gas in the ground, possibly old coal mines, possibly near old coal mines or old gas wells, which could be decades to a century old. And so you really need to know what you're drilling through before you go in there if you want to reduce methane emissions. So then another example of the sort of ambiguity and non-preciseness of the language, their proposed regulations call for a ban on storage of flowback materials, the toxic materials in open pits. But then you read carefully in the footnotes, and open pits are defined as only open pits that are actually right next to a well. If you have a large open pit that serves several wells, by their definition, that's not an open pit. It's the same problem. It's probably a larger problem. It's bigger scale. So it's a sort of a sleight of hand defining the issue away without really solving the problem. It's a misleading step. They've used traditionally diesel as a frac additive material, and they use it for a variety of reasons, but it's a lubricant among other reasons, and it's a relatively inexpensive lubricant for them to use. Congress started to get concerned about this use of diesel and actually passed a resolution prohibiting the use of diesel for fracking several years ago. It seems that some industries continued to use diesel sometime since, and there have been hearings in the House of Representatives on that, I believe. But the deeper issue here is these regulations prohibit the use of diesel. Diesel it's simply a fuel that's a mixture of a bunch of different hydrocarbons that are refined from the crude oil that come out of the ground. They contain a lot of benzene and toluene. Again, it's fairly nasty stuff. You don't really want to be breathing diesel fuel. There are a lot of other materials, other distillation products from crude oil that are very, very similar to diesel chemically, and they would include things like Jet A fuel or number 2 home heating oil, kerosene, petroleum distillates. These are all very, very similar material. In fact, you could run a diesel truck on any of the above. You could heat your home on any of the above, and the chemical risks from them are about the same. These regulations prohibit only those that are called diesel. If you want to use kerosene or petroleum distillates, even though the risks are the same and the chemistry is the same, that's allowed. Well, I mean, the concerns of the emissions are methane because of the greenhouse gas, and then a whole bunch of other hydrocarbons which are of concern for human health reasons. And the ones I would worry most about are things like benzene and toluene. These are carcinogenic, toxic substances. There's increasing evidence in the literature that they are occurring in elevated area in the atmosphere around shale gas operations, sometimes at toxic levels, certainly at levels that pose a severe risk of cancer development downline. Those things need to be specifically prohibited, and they're not in these regulations. Again, there's an ambiguity of language.